Hi everybody, thank you for coming over. My name is Nilika Jawadana, and I am chairing this wonderful panel, Imaging Women. And I just want to quickly introduce each panelist and then let them present their papers. I'm very careful about making sure everybody has equal time. So everybody will have, each presenter will have 20 minutes, and as you get close to the 5-minute mark, I'll hold up the 5-minute paper, and then when you get to the last bit, when we will shut it down, is a minute, so that I think it's respectful for each person, so that one person doesn't infringe on the other person's time or space to present their own ideas, which often happens if you don't make sure that each person gets that fair treatment. So first we have Paw-Paw Politics, Lady Skollie and the Curating of Contradiction by Professor Wamuwi Mbao of Not yet, but
hopefully
it is coming. It is of Stellenbosch University, and then Lizelle Bisschoff is presenting Women in African Cinema, Female Identity on the Screen, University of Glasgow. And then we have Tshepiso, Maleswena, Reimagining African Feminisms through the Afro-futuristic lens. And we finally have the Message of Misogyny in Hip-Hop Music and Gender Dynamics by Mamaputle, Boikanyo. Okay, all right, let's go.
I position myself so I'm being blind by talk amongst yourselves. Okay, good morning everyone. My name is Wamuwi, I'm a lecturer at Stellenbosch University, and my paper is called Paw-Paw Politics, Lady Skollie and the Curating of Contradiction. It's not going to be a terribly long paper, I'm going to say that right off the bat. I didn't think that I should really give you guys 20 minutes of my mansplaining, so it's going to be a relatively short, but hopefully somewhat insightful kind of thinking through. I also say this to alert you to the fact that it is still very much a work in progress. These are some ideas that I'm bouncing around which are going to eventually find their way into a larger piece. So this paper is concerned with the figure and the work of the, well, she was initially Cape Town based, but now she resides in Joburg, artist Laura Windvogel, who is known also by the moniker Lady Skollie. And I thought that she presented quite an interesting figure to kind of think around, because she is someone who operates in a very hyper-visible way. She makes use of social media in very distinct ways to market herself and to promote her art, and she's someone who is very much invested in the politics of the now. Her art is very much concerned with talking to the present, talking to what is going on in our society at the moment. If you can't hear me at the back, just wave your hands or rattle your jewellery or something so that I know. So, the work of Laura Windvogel, or Lady Skollie as she's known, is irreverent, it's transgressive, and it's diverse in its expression. This is one of the things that also marks her out. She's one of those artists whose work can be found across all manners of social realm, and she doesn't simply confine herself to one genre or one mode of expression. So while she does watercolor prints and various other things, she also hosts a radio show, or she hosted a radio show for a long period of time. She puts out zines, and she features in various other formats and various other media. She's someone who's very concerned with getting her message and her expression out there through as many mediums as possible. And her work invites us to think through the theatrics of sex and identity, whether it be through these visual installations or the vocal performance that she does in these radio podcasts that she puts out, or through the publication and performances that accompany her zines. And one of the zines that she put out a few years ago was called Kapstad Kinsey, and it's a very notable thing that I would suggest you all go and find. And all of these works present themselves as these very interesting moments of truth-telling, where she's attempting to put all of these ideas about desire and gender and attraction and sexuality and sex and intimacy and consent under the microscope, and to examine our preconceptions, our preconceived notions, some of the misconceptions that we have, and some of the silences that accompany these things, some of the things that we don't say, and some of the things that we're a bit shy to say when we talk about these thematics. So these are the kinetics and the thematics that kind of course through Laura Windvogel's art, and I'm going to interchangeably kind of refer to her as Laura Windvogel and Lady Skollie, and that's somewhat problematic, but it's also speaking to the fact that there is this kind of bleed over of identity between this character figure that she puts up, the Lady Skollie figure, and Laura Windvogel, the artist, and she's very self-reflexive about that and about the problematics thereof. So what is particularly striking for me in Lady Skollie's work is that it emerges as a site of very deliberate resistance at a moment where we in South Africa are grappling with what it means to inhabit a world that is violently unjust in its treatment of women. In our South African context, especially if not singularly, our disappointment with the present day, the shattering of the Mandela myth, the end of the idea of the Rainbow Nation, is only heightened by the sense that we are besieged by some sort of spiraling depravity. So we look at all of the news headlines and all of the horrifying stories that emerge daily about violence against women, violence against people who don't fall into any of the categories that hold power, the underprivileged. And we see this kind of constant depiction of this depravity, of this constant appearance of this world in which all of this violence and all of this horror is constantly with us. These shocking statistics about women being murdered by their partners, women being raped, and so on and so forth. And this has a tendency to estrange us from ourselves, to estrange us from how we think about things like sex. It's very difficult in the face of such overwhelming things to think in healthy ways about sex and desire and intimacy and what those might mean in the context of this violence, especially violence perpetrated by men against women. So the terror of this depravity, or the constant terror, the all-present terror of this depravity, corrodes our attitudes towards ideas of freedom. We no longer have that perhaps naive sense that we have arrived at the moment of freedom, that we are all living in this moment. If we ever had it, it's not necessarily to say that all of us did. Since those ideas are constantly thwarted and bisected by the politics of fear. So obviously, if you can't walk down the street at night safely because you happen to be a particular gender or a particular identity, then your conception of your idea of freedom as a South African citizen in the 21st century is going to be very different from mine as a man who is relatively free to move through areas because I don't feel that I'm going to be assaulted by someone, I don't feel that I'm going to be raped or anything of that nature. But if our present time is defined by the sense of being besieged, the question that such a state provokes is one of restitution. If, as philosopher Simon Critically puts it, we are activated by the sense that the world is irreparably flawed in a way that behooves either passive withdrawal or active destruction, so these two contesting pillars that we are faced with. Either we withdraw from society and accept that this is an unwinnable war, or we say that we have to cheerily tie everything down because it does not work in its current format. And of course, that's obviously a simplification. If things are so comprehensively fucked, how do we unfuck them? This is the question that we find ourselves asking. What might freedom look like in a violently unjust society? And how might we shape a more ethically demanding politics of relationality, relations between people? And if we look at the overall Laura Winfrey, the answer seems deceptively simple. Her work suggests that if there is a moral urgency at the heart of questions of violence, it might be better served to answer that question, it might better serve us to answer that question through the art of pleasure and play. So these are two things which I think, as we, as we look through her art, speak out quite constantly, this idea of play, this idea of needing to debunk an element of seriousness, an element of the pathological in how we examine sexuality, how we examine sex in its relation to our identities. And Winfrey forms part of that herself, in the sense that this character figure whom she erects, Lady Skollie, is this sort of harlequin trickster figure, this figure who plays on the margins of the art world. And the world that is revealed to us through the Lady Skollie persona is one that is animated by this playful sense of possibility. Her collections present us with a smorgasbord of the sensual and often lewd, the phantasmatic and physical. We see images of genitals, we see silhouettes that remind us of the imagery related to Sarah Bartman. We see mythic multi-armed figures with the omnipresent genital fruit close by, and there is storytelling, there is performance, and there is abstraction. So much of the work is read by critics, by people who interpret it as speaking directly to consciousness, and speaking directly to the problems that we face here and now. And obviously, in some sense, that is what is happening. And Winfrey, in her media presentations, also says that her work speaks directly to these things. But obviously, that's only one way of looking at this art, and it's a way of looking at art which, while it's helpful, doesn't necessarily take us very far. So if we have this idea that much of her work is directed as sort of speaking into a particular lacuna, a particular gap in how we understand ourselves, I would argue that, obviously being the nature of art, it also overflows these boundaries, so it's not simply speaking to these things, but there's something else going on there. So most discussions in Winfrey's work focus primarily on its invocation of sex. This is something which comes up time and again if you look at the news articles that kind of feature or reports that feature in the media. Certainly that itself is abiding proof that a certain optic still obtains in South Africa. Her notoriety, her sense of hyper-visibility is very much due in part to the fact that her work is concerned with the erotic, a lot of her work is concerned with the erotic. And this optic that I speak of, one in which tidy, fastened down meaning is still preferable to abstraction. So this idea that if we have an artwork that is somehow abstract, we need to make it mean something at all costs, otherwise we lose something in the process, otherwise we're afflicted with this gnawing sense of anxiety, we don't quite know what we're looking at. And it's one in which what I call the psychic archive of sexual repression and conservatism still speaks volumes, because again, the sense of, like, wow, she's doing something scandalous because she's talking about bodies. It's something that you see kind of speaking in all of the reports, sometimes more subtly, sometimes blatantly. And many of these treatments are adverse to sort of sensationalist journalistic skim reading, or if they manage more of this violently too familiar and cliched rhetorics about pushing boundaries. So again, depicting the artist as someone who is speaking out against these boundaries or these limitations without pausing necessarily to consider what might be involved in the fact that there continue to be these boundaries which push against. So very often the reports and the descriptions lag behind the art that they are trying to describe. So given the what then might be a fruitful way to read these scholars' work? At the heart of her approach to hope is an attempt to have a conversation and a concern with how that conversation is affected by the discomfort and silence and the absurd modernist projects of decency and sensibility with which Western understandings of sex are preoccupied. These have contributed greatly to erasure or obscuring different forms of knowledge around ourselves. So our understanding of sex and how it figures in our identities and how we conceive of ourselves is constantly ring-fenced by all of these notions that we inherit from the great elsewhere. That is constantly going to limit how we think about ourselves, how we define ourselves. And Lady Skollie is, in some sense, talking about opening up that, thinking about ways in which we can talk openly about aspects of sexuality, especially female sexuality, feminine sexuality, in ways that are more diverse, that move away from that optic. So to speak of this is also to come back to this notion of play, which features very much in Lady Skollie's work. What animates her work is a sense of humour. There's always this kind of underlying thread of some humorous or naughty joke going on in what she does. And here humour functions as a sort of comic acknowledgement of our own sensation, our sense of discomfort or our sense of weakness or moments of weakness. And I think that's a very useful thing, because rather than being a sort of tragic resignation to our inability to come to terms with sex and how we think about it, Lady Skollie says, well, if we laugh at ourselves, if we look at it in a less serious way, we might actually find ourselves having a conversation through that laughter. So in Winford's humour subverts the ethical demand that we live better or fuller lives, and in so doing it also subverts the obsessive pathological self-hatred, fathomless loathing and thought gaze through which we come to look at ourselves, especially in this country. While the work is intimately concerned with gnawing paradoxes, it asks what sexual liberation might mean in time of violence and rapacious predatory attacks on the freedom of women. It also engages in traffic signs in ways that suggest that eccentricity and ambiguity might be useful hieroglyphics for taking stock of where we are. So in this work, humour is not simply humour for laughter's sake, it is also polemical. The humour takes discomfort as a starting point to think the politics of sex and sensuality. And indeed, discomfort is the current undergoes both art and expressions. Whether that discomfort is viewer or observers, or the artist's own, both, it is very present and very real. It's a discomfort that is deeply concerned with knowledge and the making of meaning and experience, of course, has memory as its roots, and the archive of taboo at its disposal. Part of this discomfort is, of course, the artist's own. We get the sense of art being the sort of bold performance and ambivalence. Her sort of saying, well, I'm a little uncomfortable about this, and I'm a little uncomfortable about that. So we see, for instance, some of the collections, these very bold and striking titles, like The Only Reason, The Only Reason I predominantly paint papayas and bananas is to highlight the fear I have inside relation to unrealistic expectations of sexual and romantic encounters between men and women. That's the title. And you see again this element of this self-reflective humour made of their work. So, skipping through. And while Lady Skollie's work is very much integrated with this pictorial culture that we find ourselves in, it's very much in the medium of Instagram, Twitter, and all these things. She's ashamed of the level of hybrid visibility because her work participates in comic. So when we see these comparisons in the media, reporters comparing her to Amber Rhodes, that's a very deliberate sort of thing. There is this attention to her as the artist figure being someone who is doing transgressive things. I think that's very interesting. It's not something that we've necessarily seen before. Being given to sort of social attention to artists, especially young women artists. But of course, Skollie's work is also about self-reflexive, questioning that attention. A lot of her there's this idea of questioning why people have this need to make her the figure in the art. Paint her as the erotic as identity mold. Sense it because she is concerned with the politics of eroticism, that she is somehow part and parcel of the work that was created. How much time do we have? And there I thought well under time. Okay. So of course, having said all, and there's a lot more to be said about how Lady Skollie's work is sort of resistant to the traditional modes of exhibition and things like that. So she's a private artist. She's not represented by any gallery. She self-promotes very well using things. She has just completed the solo exhibition, a large and successful solo exhibition, which I own gallery in London. And again, there's a lot more to be said there about how she participates in these economies of art. She's very much aware of her implication in that. So she's not an artist standing aside and going, well, I refuse to participate. She knows that to some degree she has to take on a bit of publicity. But she does so in a very self-reflective way, and I think that's a particularly interesting thing. So my aim with this border paper is not to present Lady Skollie as being some sort of artistic panacea or some artist for the time that we find ourselves now. To do that would be to reinscribe the very thing that art seems avoiding. Rather, I suppose that what we encounter is not so much the idea of the didactic lesson. So they are not here to teach us something about ourselves. But as these brief moments in art where force fades, where the effect I apologize, sorry, that really should have been a lot shorter than it was.
No, it's fine, because we'll also have time for during discussion to whatever you skipped, I hope you bring it up, because that's got to be interesting stuff, right?
Hopefully. Thank you.
I know that to you. I know, I was like, oh my god, I can't stop my own.
Frightening sound.
I know.
Wow.
I use this to do things I'm doing. Like doing plank.
Stop.
Do any of you do planks? No. Yes.
Planking is planking on.
I use this and then I'm like, I'm done. Except I'm always collapsed before it.
I think I made planked once. I was drunk at the time.
So you're like, it was so funny at the beginning.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about women in African cinema. I am, just a little bit about myself, I'm South African, but I've lived in Glasgow for longer than I care to admit. I am at the University of Glasgow. I started an African Film Festival in Scotland when I started with my PhD research in 2006. So I've been working in the field of not only studying African cinema, researching it, but also creating opportunities for exhibition of African film. I have particular interest in the depictions of women and female directors working in the industry. That was the subject of my PhD. So I've written on many different aspects of women in African cinema, on nationalism, feminism, religion, tradition, female body, sexuality, health, relationships, marriage, motherhood. Even I'm very interested in the second part because I'm currently working on looking at depictions of the female cyborg in African science fiction film. So I can't talk about everything today, so I've chosen to talk about identity and show some limited number of depictions of identity that we find in various films by African women. So it's not supposed to be exhaustive, it's a sort of snapshot of some of the work that's been going on historically and also in the contemporary era. Also, I should mention that I'm working on a monograph at the moment on women in African cinema that I'm co-authoring, and that really was in a feminist framework, and that was why I really wanted to come to this conference to find out the state of African feminism today, which so far has been an amazing learning experience for me to trace what the thinking and what scholars are working on at the moment. So thinking back into the sort of origins of African cinema, sub-Saharan African cinema in the 1950s and 60s, identity has always been very central to it, and African film has been used as a tool in depicting African and negotiating African identity. This, of course, is important because of the violent confrontation with the other, the oppressive systems of colonization, imperialism, and apartheid, which has made the process of negotiating and defining identity imperative for post-colonial Africa. This process has become even more critical and complex under current conditions of continuing cultural and economic imperialism imposed by the West, unequal globalization, and questions of the place and positioning of modern Africa within the contemporary world. And this sort of negotiation between tradition and modernity is a central theme that we find recurring in African cinema. Some of you might know, might be familiar with African films. So, negotiating identity and delineating subjectivity as a collective as well as individual experience and personal experience. And the concept of identity subsumes various elements such as culture, nationality, race, ethnicity, class, gender, and sexuality. We've, of course, have already heard a lot about intersectionality in this conference, that we have to think of all these different identity markers as overlapping and intersecting. So this intersection of elements in forging an individual and social identity in modern Africa means that identity is always layered, multiple, fragmented, hybrid, and even contradictory. However, the conflicts which would often ensue from the internal or external contradictions and confrontations when defining and interrogating one's identity are often a productive force, can lead to growth and maturation of an individual and a society. Quoting the cultural theorist Stuart Hall, who described identities as never unified, but rather increasingly fragmented and fractured, never singular, but multiply constructed across different, often intersecting and antagonistic discourses, practices, and positions. And they are subject to a radical historicization and are constantly in the process of change and transformation. The question then of African cultural identity has been and remains a major concern in African filmmaking. Identity should not be seen as an already accomplished historical fact, which new cinematic discourses can represent, but instead as a production. So something that's never complete, that's always in process, and always constituted within and not outside of representation. This is the power of film, of course, of art, of creativity. Thinking back to the wonderful discussion last night, where the speakers so eloquently discussed creativity and imagination, and really the kind of political power of being able to imagine creatively, which film is, of course, part of. So when viewed as an instrument in mediating identity, filmmaking thus becomes a means of self-determination and self-definition. Defining and asserting one's own identity is a way towards emancipation, and the representation of women in African film, in particularly films by female directors, which is what I'm interested in, confirms this notion. So I suggest then that African directors produce and perform female identities through film, and when we think of gender as performance, it means that being of a certain gender is not something that you are, but something that you do. I apply this concept of performativity on different levels. There's the performance itself, for example, in how gender roles are learned and performed. In terms of the work of African filmmakers, there's good impact on the kinds of films they make and how they make their films. So the production and industrial networks and infrastructures around them, and then also, of course, the representation of performance as it occurs in the films, in their narratives. These created and performed identities are always changing, fluid, multiple, and hybrid, can be collective or singular, but most often are both. So in many African films, female characters are represented as multifaceted and often also flawed characters who respond individually to their surroundings and circumstances. The importance of societal relationships in establishing an identity remains important, since our identities are, of course, always partly made up of our interactions with others and how they view us. So female filmmakers often explore relationships in their work, which includes male-female relationships, in particular things such as marriage, divorce, polygamy, domestic violence, rape, widowhood, and forced marriage. as well as female-female relationships, which could focus on the interaction between wives in a polygamous marriage, the friendships or sisterhoods that exist between women, as well as mother-daughter relationships. One filmmaker, Regina Nakro from Burkina Faso, has, especially with her short films, which I put some on there, explored relationships in often really humorous ways. I won't go into detail of the different films, but I would highly recommend that you seek out these if you're interested in seeing how African filmmakers can often negotiate marital relationships in particular, and in quite a sort of humorous and very accessible way. Thinking then about female emancipation and leadership, I wanted to sort of first start with political emancipation. We know that the optimism that existed during the African countries' liberation struggles, which for women included the hope that life after independence would result in fuller gender equality and increased opportunities for female emancipation, did not fully deliver in the post-colonial era. The patriarchal structures of traditional African societies were reinforced by the constraints of patriarchal colonial policies, which resulted in women's indigenous and grassroots political institutions that were rapidly stripped of their former authority and own status after independence. So male African political leaders adopted policies which accelerated this decline, but these male leaders did not succeed in their attempts to erase women's influence, because strong-minded and independent women continued fighting against corruption and chauvinism and gradually started to win elections and gain appointments in higher office. We know this from the number of African women in parliaments and governments, that serves as proof of the resoluteness of and determination of these women, for example, the number of female South African judges as well. So the role of women in nationalist and liberation struggles has been well documented in African cinema. For example, two examples there, Sarah Maldoror, classic Sambizanga, which is set in the Angolan liberation struggle, and Ingrid Sinclair from Zimbabwe's feature from the Flame, which documents again the role of women in Zimbabwe's liberation struggle. However, female leadership is not only measured by the highly visible positions of leadership, such as examples of female members of parliament or women in positions of power, because it also includes other forms of leadership, such as spiritual leadership, the rural women's localized collectives, economic emancipation through small-scale entrepreneurship, and individual emancipation within the domestic sphere. Also, importantly, the emancipation of women does not necessarily lead to a disruption of traditional societal structures. African women often negotiate power through their traditional roles, such as mother and carer. And we've also heard this mentioned by several speakers in the conference so far, referring to the term of Nego-feminism, for example, by the Nigerian feminist Mbao, where she describes Nego-feminism as a feminism of negotiation. Many examples exist in particular documentaries, and women all over the world, and also in Africa, make more documentaries than make fiction feature films, depict these micro-narratives of ordinary African women's everyday lives, and showing how they reach emancipation and leadership within their own lives. So when exploring the socio-economic empowerment of African women, it's important to recognize also the urban-rural divide which exists in Africa, since rural African women are still the poorest and least literate and educated groups. Urban migration has a prevalent impact on male-female relationships, such as depicted in the work of Safi Faye from Senegal. Safi has made a lot of films that depict set in her own community, the Serer people in Senegal, and she makes the kind of ethnographic documentary filmmaking where she is not sort of observing the people and documenting their lives from the outside, but she does that from the inside, because she is depicting the traditions of her own people, and particularly women. Her film Selby, one among many, is about the personal struggle of one woman whose story has collective social significance, as indicated in the title of the film. It depicts the roles of women in bearing the economic burden of caring for their families as men leave temporarily for the urban centres in search of jobs. I argue that Faye's foregrounding of rural women, in particular allowing them opportunities to express themselves, could be regarded as progressive, because her films are set in a context where women are rarely given a public voice, as can be seen in the exclusively male palavers that we see depicted in this film, Selby. Selby is a 39-year-old mother of 8, and she's representative of many other women who are forced to take on the full economic burden of caring for their children as their husband temporarily leave. Fire documents the continuous domestic activities and farm work of Selby, with Selby discussing her challenging circumstances with an off-screen Fire while she goes on about her daily tasks. We never see Safi Fire on screen, though she provides a voiceover on several occasions to expand on certain details of Selby's life. Her presence is acknowledged by the characters, but she never intervenes in the narrative flow or adopts a strong authorial voice. So unlike lots of Western-made documentaries about African cultures, in particular Western ethnographic and anthropological filmmaking, Fire as filmmaker, as I said, is not an outsider to the cultures she documents, which is clear from the way in which her subjects effortlessly trust and confide in her. So there's a strong sense of female femininity and female solidarity conveyed in the depictions of the ways in which the women support each other physically and psychologically. And in contrast to the women's punishing workload, we see the men of the village are often sitting around, complaining, not contributing much or sharing the women's work. But despite the hardship of village life, as documented in Selby and also some of Safi Faye's other films, her films depict Senegalese peasants, in particular the women as articulate, socially conscious, and displaying strength of character. A more recent film, also from West Africa, is the film Frontiers or Borders by the Burkinabe director Apolline Traoré. This was the opening film at the Bisschoff Film Festival this year in February in Ouagadougou. It's a road movie that depicts the journey at the heart of its narrative, as the genre of the road movie dictates. It shows the physical and logistical challenges of traveling from one African country to another. It's a spiritual and symbolic journey of friendship, acceptance, and understanding between 4 African women from 4 different African countries: Burkina Faso, Benin, Senegal, and Nigeria. There's the poster of the film, and here this is a photo shoot during the Bisschoff Film Festival with the 4 main actresses and the director in the middle. So we have Hajara. She's a Senegalese trader. She's the main protagonist of the film. She meets an Ivorian merchant, a Nigerian woman living in Burkina Faso is returning home from her sister's wedding, and a young student who's carrying out a task for an untrustworthy fiancé. Their journey eventually enables them to free themselves from the authority of men and to assert their own identities and agency. We see them repeatedly subjected to patriarchal and phallocratic powers, enacted by corrupt policemen and custom officers, invariably male. Racketeering and sexual abuse is rife. But through these hardships and the sharing of their personal narratives and stories of patriarchal abuse, the 4 women band together. Moving to South Africa, then I wanted to mention Sarah Bletcher's Ayanda, thank you, which is a vibrant, modern, urban set film. There's an urban set aesthetic. It tells an uplifting coming-of-age story of a young girl, Ayanda, who trains as a mechanic while finding her own identity and overcoming hardships of the past, including her father's death and some dark family secrets. Has anyone seen Ayanda? Yeah. Okay, so I was going to show the trailer, but you've got an idea of what the film is about. I wanted to talk then just briefly about female traditions, particularly in the work of Katie Lena Ndais from Senegal. She's made 2 beautiful documentaries, A Waiting for Men and Traces, Women's Imprints. Traces is set in Burkina Faso. It's on the tradition of wall paintings by the Kassena women in southern Burkina Faso, and then Waiting for Men is set in the Mauritanian town of Walata on the edge of the Sahara Desert, also depicting the female tradition of wall painting. The beautiful stylized documentaries and the performative elements of these films are really interesting because the women are encouraged within the safe space, safe and intimate space of being filmed, and through the trust that clearly exists between the filmmaker and the female subjects to reveal a lot about themselves. So the making of the documentaries allows the women space to perform their gender subjectivity that they otherwise might not have done in other situations. Here I also wanted to refer to the film The Wedding Ring by Ramatu Keita from Niger. This is again a film set in Niger, in the village in a village where she's from, depicting the traditions of the Sahelian people from Niger. The main character is this beautiful Lady Tia, which is actually she's the director's daughter. It's a story that deals with her longing for her lost love when she returns home from studying abroad, and it depicts the beauty of the traditions and customs of the Sahelian people in exquisite detail. Interestingly, the film has been accused, mostly by white film critics, of being ethnographic, which is quite interesting in terms of that she's depicting her own people. I think, nobody would accuse Martin Scorsese of making an ethnographic film about this is the Sicilian American people. The waiting room thing. Then I don't actually think I was briefly going to refer to mixed race identities in film, which we also see in cinema. I won't go into detail about that, but I think this touches upon the notion that a lot of African filmmakers, also women, live and work outside of their countries of origin. They might have a mixed race identity that they negotiate through their films, as these two directors, Isabelle Bonny-Claverie from Ivory Coast in France, and Sarah Boyan from Burkina Faso and France, who sort of negotiate. And Sarah Boyan's film in particular, which is called Notre Étrangère, the English title is The Place in Between, and it's exactly that idea of being in an in-between place, with having in this case, an African mother and a French father, and now you negotiate your identity within that dual sense of belonging. So in this paper, then, I aim to show how female identity can be performed on various levels in film. This means that identity should not be regarded as something rigid, but as a changeable and multiple construct, existing on many different levels, such as social, racial, traditional, collective, individual, and religious. Female identity is negotiated in African cinema in ways that emphasize the multidimensionality and fluidity of identity, depicting women as complex, multifaceted, and sometimes flawed human beings. In these films, the examples of how female identity is performed in a variety of spheres could lead to questioning set and archaic categories of identity in the ways that they exist within traditional patriarchy, and the formation of new forms of identity. And ultimately, this is what I'm interested in how film, as a creative force, can depict visions for the future that us as viewers can learn from and can strive to.
Thank you so much. So my paper, which is still in its very rough stages, is called Reimagining African Feminism Through the Afro-Futuristic Lens. So it's basically an amalgamation of ideas, I'm echoing Wamuwi sentiment, ideas that I'm kicking around. And yeah, so I haven't published the paper yet, but this is basically the gist of what I think is going to be the final product. The past, the present, and the future are three spaces of time which are not separate, as much as we've been taught and been made to believe that they are separate entities. They are actually influencing each other, and they all exist all at the same time. And this quote by Naima Saifa Sandy, who's a curator and anthropologist, captures the essence of this conceptualization quite well. She says, time is really this fluid thing. Now is now, but the past is now, and the future too. So, and you will hear as I explain, as I carry on with my presentation, why I believe that now is always, now is in the past, now is now, and now is in the future, that will come together. So let's start from the beginning. How I got into the study or the science and wanting to know more about Afrofuturism was simply through this very image. I saw this image, it was on someone's arm. She had tattooed this picture onto her arm. And I have something about this image, just, it changed, it captivated me. Because I could see that this is obviously a black woman. She has braids, she's got a thick lips, it's a black African woman. But then there's something about this black African woman that seems like she's not just living now, but she is also coming from or looking into the future, and that is the fact that her eyes are hollowed out.
And I'd never ever seen an image like this in all my artistic and everything that I've come across. So for me, I wanted to know more about the artist and what influenced this image, and that's how that's how I discovered the term Afrofuturism. And if you look at Afrofuturistic artwork, most of it, the eyes are hollowed out, and that's where the futurism aspect comes from. And so I did more research, and I found out that this is a drawing done by a woman, a Canadian woman, Canadian visual artist called Sarah Golish. And amongst all her artworks, and she has various representations of women, but then she represents Black women in this specific Afrofuturistic way. And she's been painting and depicting Black women as Afrofuturistic and celestial beings for quite a number of years. So I was very excited when I got into it. And one of the definitions of Afrofuturism, so there's two definitions I'm going to give you of Afrofuturism, and one of them is from a Nigerian woman. She calls herself by the name of Cosmic Yoruba. She's an author, and she's also a science fiction writer. And she defines Afrofuturism as a response to any imagined future that excludes Black people, or perspectives from Black culture as well as African history. Artists and writers and those invested in Afrofuturism are attempting to include and represent Black people in the future as they imagine it. And another definition from what I like to refer to as the Afrofuturistic Bible. It's a book by Yatasha Womack. It's called Afrofuturism, Perceptions of a study of Black science fiction and fantasy culture. And she defines Afrofuturism as a highly intersectional way of looking at possible futures or alternate realities through a Black cultural lens. It is non-linear, fluid, and feminist. It uses the Black imagination to consider mysticism, metaphysics, identity, and liberation. And despite offering Black folks a way to see ourselves in a better future, Afrofuturism blends the future, the past, and the present. And that's how we're going back to the quote of all the three things always happening at the same time. So perhaps I need to step back to give you an understanding of why this is so important to me as a Black woman. I'm a nerd. I think we've kind of sort of figured that out by now. And growing up, I'd seen white people depicted in every way imaginable. White characters were nuanced, and their stories were told from all angles, irrespective of genre. The message was clear to me that white people were diverse and had stories that could be told from multiple perspectives. I did not see this for Black people. We seem to only exist within confined genres. And even then, so like either we would be in comedies or dramas. And even in these stories, Black people seem to always play like the same trope. So either you are the sidekick to the white person, or you're the help, or it's a slave movie. I attributed this to Black people. Oh, yes. And then so, for me, a person who is into science fiction, fantasy, mythology, I didn't see any Black people at all. So on the one hand, you see Black people always in the same character, always in the same, playing the same role. On the other hand, on things that actually interest me, which is, as I said, science fiction, fantasy, adventure, all of that, I don't see Black people at all. Unless if it's like maybe like a god at the tower bridge, but you don't see any Black people in my genre. So I attributed this to Black people having a lack of imagination, and it made me believe that Black people didn't have many stories to tell, and that as a people, our limited experiences were not worthy or interesting enough to be documented. So I was big into Star Wars and Star Trek. I read the books, watched the show, watched the movies, and I'd never, as you can see, there are no Black people here, but this is what I love, this is what I'm interested in. So when I got to high school, this belief that Black people didn't have imagination or interesting stories to tell. Oh, and this is Terry Pratchett, and one of my favorite books. Terry Pratchett wrote about ghouls and wizards and witches and warlocks, and I literally lived off Terry Pratchett. I had stacks and stacks of Terry Pratchett books. But if you can look at all the Terry Pratchett characters, aside from that character, there are also no Black people. So everything that I'm consuming, no one looks like me, no one sounds like me, so my story is not told. But when I got to high school, I discovered anime, manga. So yeah, anime is the show, and then manga is the cartoons. Anime is a form of Japanese animation. And that's when I realized that actually the fact that Black people don't have stories, it's not normal. That's when it became abnormal. So okay, white people have dragons and medieval times, and they've got, all kinds. And then Japanese people have anime. Black people also have stories, and like where are Black stories? But what I did see that whenever anything came to fantasy related to Black people, it was always the same story: Black magic, voodoo. It was always evil. It was always sinister. There was no nuance in it. There is good magic. There is bad magic, and you always hear, especially in the South African context, they referred to all traditional anybody who was a traditional healer, a sangoma, as a witch doctor, and a witch doctor is umtarati. But there's you have umtarati, you have isangoma, you have inyanga, you have abaprophet, but it was always witch doctor, which just painted everything that is African spiritual as muti and voodoo, and it's dark and it's evil and it's bad. So and that's when I realized through anime, I realized that actually we have stories of spirituality and philosophies and African technology that has not been told. And that's why Afrofuturism is so important. And that's when I discovered Afrofuturism, I fell in love with it. And I'm going to just switch to the feminism side of things, of where the feminist aspect of it, well, no, not of it, but where my feminism comes from. So I want to talk about how I got into feminism. The first person who introduced me to feminism was my grandmother. And I knew about feminism before I knew the term feminism. So just a quick description of my grandmother. My grandmother was what we would call now a firebrand. Growing up, I just knew that my granny didn't take nonsense. That's what I knew. But now I know that the term is called firebrand. My grandmother never married. She smoked, she drank, and she would beat up men. My grandmother would beat up men that would step out of line. That's what she was known for in the family, that if you want somebody to come and deal, and she was quite a strong woman. My grandmother beat up men, my grandmother slaughtered animals. She was just such a, and she would take up space in a room. And my grandmother, when I was quite young, she taught me that I'm the only girl, so it's me, I've got 2 brothers. She taught me that my brothers and I, by me being born a woman and them being born boys, we are different. We're not the same. And the difference is that I am fundamentally superior to them. And growing up, she would always tell me, she's like, you know what, I love you, I love your brothers, but you are a woman, so you're better than your brothers. And for the time, my grandmother was born in 1934, for someone for her to be so forward thinking and for her to just believe in women's autonomy and women's power, it was, and now I appreciate it because now I understand feminism. But yeah, she would also, and she should beg me never to get married. She said, never marry because men are just going to hold you back. And she always told me that you need to be autonomous. Nobody needs to tell you how you must live your life. For all of that and how my feminism has been shaped, my grandmother refused to wear pants. Not in a single day did my grandmother ever wear pants. She insisted on wearing dresses and skirts because she said that made her feel like a lady and made her feel beautiful. So that's how I understand that feminism is not, it's a complex spectrum. And that's why I sought out and I seek out African feminism, because it takes it oh,
It's okay.
it's okay. Oh. It makes, there is a space for our cultures, our traditions within that space. And Western feminism, as I got older, started to make less and less sense for me, because I found it that Western feminism sought to be more like men, whereas African feminism said, as a woman, you are enough. And a quote by a definition by American feminist Gwendolyn McKell, when she says, African feminism owes its origin to different dynamics than those of generated Western feminism. It has largely been shaped by African women's resistance to Western hegemony and its legacy within African culture. So that is how I came into my understanding of feminism within the African context. And this slide, when I got to university and in 2015, this is when I realized, and this is when feminism became a matter of survival for me. It wasn't just me exercising autonomy anymore. Now, actually, I needed feminism to survive. And then through these tumultuous weeks, which turned into months, the feminist movement brought it to everyone's attention that homophobia, transphobia, patriarchy, and toxic masculinity could not exist in a space that we claim to be progressive and emancipated. And hence the saying comes, the revolution will be intersectional or it will be bullshit. And for me, African feminism doesn't leave anyone behind. Whether you are a gender non-conforming, non-binary, gay, lesbian, trans, if you are black, we're all in this together, and that for me was very important. Just trying to, in the interest of time, and then I just want to touch on. Okay, yeah, that's me. Yay. I want to also speak about now where feminism, as I understand it, and Afrofuturism intersect. Oh, and also, my Africanness and my cultures are not separate from my feminist identity, which is why, for me, patriarchy that masquerades as culture is so infuriating. So the intersection now comes in another form of artwork, another artwork by Sarah Golish. This one, I could say, is more important than the first image that I showed you. And as you can see, the eyes are hollowed out. She's an African woman, but the reason why I got the link when it clicked, when I actually understood that Afrofuturism in its essence is quite feminist and it's got an African feminist energy, is when I saw the painting, or the drawing rather, of Kwezi. So the big thing about this image is that it's the name of this painting. Her name is Kwezi, and Kwezi, it's a Zulu word for bright morning star. And Sarah Golish, when she explains it, so she has a sun dust and a moon dust collection. This particular image comes from her sun dust collection, which she explains as a salute to the fertility of the sun goddess through 10 portraits of women from the continent most touched by the sun's embrace, which is Africa. Compelled by the lack of female personified deities, Golish aims to revise and re-examine the male-dominated sun god through the recasting of the past in order to re-envision the future. Released on the eve of summer solstice, the Lady of Sundust represents and celebrates all that is light, powerful, and life-giving. So from the 10 ladies, I was drawn to Kwezi. And the reason I was drawn to Kwezi is that what this image represents, and when I hear the name Kwezi, I immediately think of the woman who Jacob Zuma raped in 2006. But for me, when I look at this image and I think about the kind of history that we have in this country, Kwezi is a refusal to be silenced. Kwezi, the sun goddess. And it's a refusal to be silenced, to comply with patriarchal society that wants to kill us. The woman we know as Kwezi, the rape survivor, was an African feminist, an activist, a victim, and a survivor. And a deity. Kwezi, the sun goddess, her name means bright morning star. So for me, it's those two women's histories, the history of a deity, of a goddess, and the history of a woman who was very much a human being, who lived, who was victimized and ultimately killed by the very toxic patriarchal society. When I look at this image, I see I see feminism personified in the way that, yes, Kwezi has not yet received justice. She died without receiving justice. But I have hope when I see this image that other women who have been raped, who have been killed by either your powerful figures or fathers, brothers, boyfriends, for me, when I look at this image, they are personified in this image as much as Kwezi, Fezaga Kuzwayo, is represented in this image. I don't know if I'm making sense, but that's why this image was so important to me. And then I just want to move on to the other images. So then, as my Afrofuturism quiz carries on, Afrofuturism, why it's also, there's a lot of other feminist images. So the bottom left-hand corner, the bottom corner here, that is done by a West African artist. It's a painting, and that represents God. So the woman is God, and she's holding a man. So in her hands, to say that as a woman, the power, we are God. God is a black woman. God is a black African woman. And that is actually one of my favorite Afrofuturistic paintings. As you can see, she is of now, because she looks like she's from our time, but her eyes are hollowed out, which means that she exists now and she exists in the future. And another image that I like is this one over here of the grandmother, because that looks like any typical grandmother from a village, but there is something futuristic about the way she has been depicted, so that our grandmothers, our mothers, our ancestors, they live with us. So there is no past, there is no time that's gone by. Everything exists all at the same time. And that is why I put this cloth over here, because that speaks of the African spiritual side of Afrofuturism, the side that connects with ancestry, with mythology, with things that cannot be explained. Yeah. And then, just to move on quickly, so these are some of my favorite people who are writing, performing, and curating ourselves into existence. Octavia Butler and Joelle Gomez are African-American women who write about, let me just move quickly, who write about queer vampires. So they write about the fledgling. Octavia Butler wrote a book called The Fledgling, which is a story about a family of vampires who were enslaved. Well, it's a black family who were enslaved, but then one of the daughters discovered that she has vampire powers. I'm not sure how to say it, but discovered that she is a vampire. And then Joelle Gomez also writes about a black American lesbian woman a queer woman who is also a vampire. Simpiwe Dana, if anyone has ever seen her video of Ndiredi, it's very Afrofuturistic, and she has been constantly playing in the Afrofuturism space, because you'll see that her outfit is very futuristic, but then she always has this tone that shows the connection between the future and the past, and as well as the present. Busim Mhlongo, one of my favorite artists, by referring to herself as an urban Zulu, she holds on to her identity, but she's an urban Zulu, which means that she exists in the past, she exists now, and she also exists in the future. Kama Gwini, I love how she incorporates the use of an electrical guitar in her music. I'm just gonna wrap up quickly. And then Tori Morrison in Beloved, I wanted to actually read out an expert about how I think Beloved speaks to the world of the ancestors, but yeah, there's no time for that. And then if you please do yourselves a favor, please read books. Nedi Orakafo, if anyone's ever heard of her, she's an amazing, like, I'm losing my mind, I can't get enough of her. And then also Mohale Mashego, typo, but in her book The Yearning, I don't want to give away the plot, but also if you want to talk African spirituality, Mohale curates that nicely. And then just quickly, the future of Afrofuturism. These are some of the people that I'm looking at who are doing big work, important work in the Afrofuturistic space. And I just want to jump quickly to the second one, Eugene Mapondera. So Eugene is a Zimbabwean, he writes comic books about a bounty huntress. Her name is Umzingeli. And he's written comics about her, and then what she does, she's a bounty hunter, so she hunts out criminals and she deals with them quite decisively. But I've got some critiques for Afrofuturism, that even in this space, you'll find that, yes, she's a black woman, but she still has very like Eurocentric features, small ways. You see that it's been written by a man. It's a comic that's been drawn and written by a man. So, and then, yeah, I've got a couple of critiques, but this is one of my critiques, so that we, as much as this is a space that's growing, we still need to, as women, start finding our voice in there. And then, oh no, lost slide.
It's okay. Just finish up.
Okay, yeah, that's it. I wanted to play a
Why
song.
don't you read the quote
Oh.
by Toni Morrison? It's important. Just finish with that. This is a great song.
I can't play.
Play the song.
Okay.
Song. Yes.
Okay, let me play the song and then I'll get into. Can someone help me?
But do you have it on the? Do you have this?
Yes, it's on
Do you
here.
have it like on the stick as well?
Yeah. No, it's on.
I have the song. You do.
Actually, I'm taking up so much time. I'm so
No,
sorry.
you're not. It's fine. Just another minute. This is technical.
I'm not gonna play the whole
Bring
song.
out the video.
I'm not gonna play the whole song. You guys want me to sing?
Yeah. Go ahead.
All my niggas in the whole wide world. No. Okay. But the words I wanted to sing made the song, make it all your turn for us. This shit is for us. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, you were.
water, just in case. Yes. Okay, last presenter. She will return.
Okay, I'm going to be talking about the message of misogyny in hip-hop music, specifically mainstream commercial hip-hop. I'm going to sit down, just in case I might die or collapse.
Don't die. We're not judging.
Okay.
It's okay.
I'll start. The content of commercial mainstream hip-hop music and music videos tends to present its consumers with images and lyrics that portray the dichotomy between men and women. It offers portrayals of women proffered by male voices which depict them as gold diggers, bitches, and hoes who are dependent on men for a desirable social status. It especially influences attitudes that impose on black female identity and the way societies treat and respond to black women. In this presentation, I'll be paying particular attention to the sexism and misogyny located in the commercial, mainstream, contemporary South African hip-hop music. I would like to state that this essay does not seek to criminalize or vilify hip-hop on its own as a music genre for its misogyny, as hip-hop seems to be a reflection of a patriarchal society. Rather, the main purpose of this study is to critically examine the sexist language and imagery used in commercial mainstream hip-hop music and videos, and to understand the harmful message located in hip-hop about black women. As Trisha Rose fervently states, I love hip-hop so much that I must speak the truth about the demise of the spirit of hip-hop insofar as it has been taken over by these ideas about women. Remaining silent on the problematic issues of the music genre simply because we love it does a disservice to its consumers and to the genre itself, as it flippantly continues to normalize offensive, distorted, and limited images of black women in a society where the female body and female subjectivity is always at risk of abuse. By contrast, I argue that engaging in critical, open discussions about it opens up a dialogue that is more nuanced than the monologue that is proffered by the dominant male voice that speaks in the majority of commercial mainstream hip-hop music. The current South African hip-hop scene seems to be at its commercial peak in comparison to earlier years, with artists like AKA and Casper Nyovest receiving international attention from the BET Awards and various other media outlets, collaborating with American hip-hoppers and performing at international events. For the past several years now, and in its current state, South African hip-hop music has become increasingly commercialized. Tshepiso Monaheng contends cutting-edge rappers are being sidelined in favor of tried and tested mainstays, creating a cycle of regurgitated talent that receives preferential treatment by radio stations, booking agents, and sponsors. Indeed, the South African hip-hop music scene is sustained by a select group of rap artists. The boys have turned hip-hop into a boys' club, wrote musician and artist Ntiki Mazwai when she addressed the gender dynamics and prejudice present in the world of hip-hop on her blog. Mazwai believes that unless you're the tomboy, unless you're pulling the half-naked sexy card, it is very difficult to get them rappers' attention. Rose points out that what happens in hip-hop is that the more market success it has, the narrower the image and the stories become. This has certainly proved to be the case in the South African hip-hop industry, where the increased commercialization has resulted in images and messages that are limited to moneyed lifestyles, consumerism, and the objectification of women. Of course, the industry does not only consist of male rappers. In recent years, rap artists like Gigi Lamaine, Rouge, Fifi Cooper, and Nadia Nakai have gained popularity in the media, showing an unmatched increase in the presence of female rappers in the South African hip-hop industry in comparison to earlier years. However, the industry is nevertheless criticized for its bias towards male artists, as seen through the criticism by Mazwai and Toya DeLazy, who called hip-hop in South Africa the Sausage Festival. DeLazy is referring to the sense of masculinism in mainstream hip-hop, characterized by the perpetuation of patriarchal ideologies, strengthened by capitalist-centered and consumerist ways of thinking. To demonstrate what follows in this presentation is an analysis of Good Girls and Snapchat Hoes by Nasty C, and an evaluation of Mosley's Don't Panic to further illustrate the ways in which female rappers engage with the misogyny present in popular hip-hop music. So you have the lyrics there. I'm just going to play the video so you can watch and read the lyrics as I analyze. Okay. Nasty C's Good Girl Snapchat Hoes, like many singles written by mainstream artists, encapsulates masculinism and an aspect of patriarchy that has legitimized hegemonic masculinity and the subordination of feminine subjects since its propagation by powerful Western capitalist states since colonialism. Masculinism is characterized by several features, including an emphasis on fundamental differences between men and women, the symbolic exaggeration and idealization of social created masculinities, as well as excessive and exclusively male values. A new and ideal masculinity emerging out of the post-apartheid era, defined by its celebration of assertions of power and wealth, with acquisition predicated on entitlement, use of violence and brute strength, rather than personal achievement or respect for the legitimate use of power, has also been perpetuated by ANC leaders such as Jacob Zuma, as well as EFF's Julius Malema, alongside South African rappers. This type of masculinity dismisses any efforts to achieve gender equity, as it associates the latter with anti-African Western values and widespread lack of male economic advancement. This is a significant point considering how rappers like Nasty C or Casper Nyovest, who continue to garner continued success and wealth, are respected and celebrated by fans because they represent an unexpected, almost divinely ordained social mobility that arises against the grain of conventional women, that is, against the common narratives of impoverishment and unrewarding struggles of black South Africans in the era of post-apartheid. In songs, rappers like Nasty C embrace this constructed and idealized black masculinist identity and persona, which explicitly rejects gender equity and turns a blind eye to the dynamicity and the complexity of female identities and subjectivity. In songs like Good Girls and Snapchat Hoes, Nasty C adumbrates what he considers ideal feminine behavior, and he thereby contributes to normalize limited stereotypes about black women, which also re-legitimize traditional gender relations. Despite the feminine identities that transcend his stereotypical definitions of black women. The song is divided into a first section dedicated to good girls and a second section focused on deprecating Snapchat hoes. It begins with a catchy hook over a smooth rhythmic beat where the rapper sings the lyrics on the page. The hook is an example of a representation of black women based on an obsession in mainstream hip-hop with typifying and categorizing ideal feminine behavior and demonizing, while also glorifying and exploiting women who fall outside of this ideal. If the good girl exits the private space of home dressed in whatever is deemed inappropriate by the rapper or other members of the opposite sex, she is immediately only useful as the humiliated source of sexual gratification for the male rapper. But if she stays good, then according to Nasty C, she is apparently so worthy of respect and love that males should sacrifice all religion and praise her. The hoe is mostly useful as a sex object, is denied the respect and divine love meant for the good girl. This objectifies both the good girl and the hoe, as they are treated as objects of abuse, control, and or as objects of sexual gratification. But what is particularly interesting about the video is that the typical presence of the rapper and video vixens, who are usually seen to be wearing little clothing, adorning synthetic hair, and possessing ideal female body types such as thick, are replaced by black women in white tank tops who have their hair natural or are bald and less sexualized. The women in this video act as the conveyors of Nasty C's message in his absence, as they lip-sync his words and dance to his music. They are merely muted vessels used to report masculinist ideologies that seek to maintain archaic views about gender roles in the same way that video vixens and models are objects used to project male fantasies and desires. The director, Carl Lewis, said that, because the song was part of a trilogy of videos, he said that it was an art piece about Nasty C's journey of breaking free and becoming a man, and it was a visual metaphor for breaking away from the ideals of the past and becoming true to yourself.
However, as I've shown, the lyrics of the song seek to maintain traditional gender roles. So while the black man of the post-apartheid era transcends ideals of the past and becomes true to himself, black women's identities are expected to stay stuck in bygone eras, denying them subjective experiences. The first verse concerns itself with the Snapchat hoe's aspirations for wealth and fame. In interviews, mainstream rappers state that showing off wealth and fame in their songs is intended to inspire others. Nasty C stated in an interview that you can't make it sound like you're making fun of someone who doesn't have those things or can't afford those things. I can brag about it like that, but to inspire someone else who's listening. Tellingly, however, the lyrics in his song encourages both the good girl and the Snapchat hoe to aspire to a life in the domestic space, and the Snapchat hoe is reproached, humiliated, and satirized for striving for the same kind of life of celebrity and prosperity that Nasty C actively endorses. In particular, the Snapchat hoe is animalistically and mechanistically dehumanized. Women who are animalistically dehumanized are seen as lacking morality and culture, with an emphasis on certain sexual body parts or fragmentation, and revoke reactions of disgust and humiliation, while mechanistically dehumanized women are perceived as cold and superficial and evoke responses of emotional dissociation. We see a combination of both in the song. Take note of how her desires for luxury and wealth are made laughable when he references her fake jewelry and her bank account, how the exaggerated size of her behind is both sexually applauded and is a subject of humor and derision simultaneously. Learning on her trip to fame does not constitute subjective, meaningful experience and life lessons. Rather, for the Snapchat hoe, learning is relegated to sexual experiences. Because this process of fragmentation takes the sexualized female body part and interprets it as constituting her entire being, the hoe is denied human attributes associated with the mind and personality, and this process is complete within the second verse, when Nasty C raps in a much more aggressive tone that he likes his bitches quiet as a mute, wetter than the lube, and naked as the truth, thus reinforcing the objectification of woman by presenting the silent, inert, and sexually useful female as the ideal. Praising and glorifying inactive, silent, and sexualized females in his song is particularly disturbing, considering the silencing women are subject to in South Africa and around the world, especially in the context of sexual, physical, verbal, and emotional abuse. But rappers are rarely made accountable for their offensive and insensitive lyrics. While writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has been rightfully criticized for denying transgender womanhood, Nyovest's lyrics about Caster Semenya have been ignored. At his worst, Nyovest's lyrics consist of simplistic and artless lines such as "Let's dumb it down so they understand, Casper Semenya, yeah, I'm the man." This lyric from the song Bishashe, featuring OK Balloon Cool Cat, conveys a heteronormative view that makes strict binary genders the norm, implies the abnormality of LGBTI individuals, and fixes the abnormality in order to express Nyovest's manliness. The lyric functions through an arbitrary reliance on how Caster Semenya's first name rhymes with the rapper's stage name, while depicting ignorant and narrow views about gender. Similarly, when rapper Altido sang "Face Like Beyonce, Ass Like Sarah Barakman" in his single "Dlala Ka Yona, Play With It," he was never called out for using a historically and culturally sensitive topic that involved the commercialization of the exoticized and animalized black female body of Barakman by white Europeans to reinstate unfair sexual scripts of gold diggers and hoes for black women. Whether the reason for the limited criticism and lack of accountability is due to a disinclination by fans and the media to cast a bad light on black male financial empowerment, or is because rappers are supposedly rapping about their own personal experiences which exonerate them from criticism, overlooking these callous remarks makes us complicit in normalizing masculinism and gives male rappers and others the power to exercise labeling, oppression, and domination against discriminated groups such as black women. In the process of perpetuating masculinist ideologies that depend on exaggerated gender dichotomies which discriminate, typify, and objectify women, Nasty C's single not only fails to acknowledge the complexity, variety, richness, and humanness of feminine identities, but also ignores the many ways in which various complex female identities can contribute to society in other ways than being useful for male sexual gratification or in domestic spaces in order to satisfy male values. Moving on to Mosley's song. While the hip-hop music scene is rife with male rappers, sexist speech, and archaic masculinist values which oppress female subjectivity, female rappers are agents of action in their rap songs and videos. The messages they choose to convey speak about their topics of interest, and also include dialogical elements that speak in opposition to male rapper values, but can also affirm and comply with them. Like many rap songs, Mosley's lyrics in Don't Panic are used to assert her own power. Her song's lyrics declare her abundant financial power and mock her male addressee's financial lack, while the video for the song depicts her in different fashions and items of clothing which she uses to claim or embrace various identities. The lyrics to the first verse of the song encompasses the player and the not played, or the dominator and the not dominated identity, which is common in hip-hop music and works well as a strategy to assert one's identity as a female rapper. The first verse of the song functions by linking the female rapper character with two very different famous and infamous women to enhance what is known in popular culture to be the bad bitch character. The Gracie Michelle comparison is used to show off her wealth, but it might be particularly offensive because it reinterprets Michelle's life and behavior into the gold digger sexual script offered specifically to females in society, which is furthermore constantly being normalized in mainstream male-dominated hip-hop music. It is worth noting, however, that female rappers rarely use the term gold digger to describe themselves, and instead often reinterpret the term positively to glamorize a woman who is able to access money from a wealthy man, or see a woman as deserving of being in a relationship with a man who is financially secure. Mosley's financial lack of her male addressee. This reinforces distorted views about masculinity and supports patriarchal and masculinist ideologies which define masculinity through a man's economic power. Her lyrics show off her financial independence and unashamedly express how she only prefers attention from and seeks relationships with men who are financially secure. Her messages are particularly significant in the context of the realities of poverty, as black women in South Africa have been disproportionately affected by poverty compared to other groups, and yet they are unfairly labeled as gold diggers and subsequently contorted into money-hungry hoes in the media whenever they seek relationships with financially secure partners. With regards to the imagery in the video, Mosley is seen to depict herself wearing different styles of clothing, which allow her to embrace various personas seamlessly. These different aesthetical representations of herself, which include her as a tomboyish character, a sexy diva in a parking lot alongside DJ Speedster, a poised lady, and a woman donned in indigenous South African ethnic attire, can be interpreted as a way to embrace different identities while still maintaining her sexual freedom, financial power, and independence. The beginning part of the first verse is kindly asking the male addressee not to make any sexual advances towards her. The lines "Uskang tshwara raf, nginamahloni, futhi ubongibheka kahle, ngiphume eGoli" translate to "Don't grope me, I'm shy. Also look at me carefully, I'm from Johannesburg," and are followed by denunciations and warnings from the rapper telling him not to force himself on her, and subsequently calling him a criminal for his attempts to do so. These passages from the verse clearly speak to the real issues of sexual violence in society, and the rapper also uses these lines to once again address her identity and tell the licentious, dangerous male addressee that she's shy, which can also be interpreted as embarrassed, cautious, or conservative. But she's also just as dangerous as he is, implying that she can defend herself and go to war with him. On its own, the expression, which involves a successful defense from sexual violence by Mosley as a character in her own song, may seem fine, but I would like to consider it in another light. If female rappers were to engage with the social issues of sexual violence in their songs and normalize successful defenses of sexual violence in the same way that male rappers continue to perpetuate harmful, distorted, and insulting perceptions of black women as gold diggers and hoes in their discussions of courtship rituals, then Mosley's remarks in this imagined context and in the context of popularized commercial hip-hop, which depends on the player-played complex, would cease to become a personal experience or issue in much the same way that male-dominated perceptions of black women have ceased to do so. Rather, a popularized and normalized experience of sexual violence that would exist under the mainstream hip-hop's codes and conventions of the individual's ability to overpower and dominate others fails when we consider how society and the law idealizes good agency and constructs ideal victims in rape cases and sees women who do not resist or unable to corroborate their resistance as blameworthy non-victims. In this single instance, I do not think Mosley or her co-writers would intend to idealize certain rape victims, but I do think that because popularized hip-hop music with its codes and conventions has been so bent on exaggerating individualistic identities of dominance and overpowering others, that it has often found itself ignoring and forgetting those with relatively less power. I make this statement to offer an analogy of how messages and images in hip-hop become narrower and more normalized as hip-hop becomes commercialized, and to point out how this commercialization skews apparent personal experiences in favor of unfair stereotypes about black women. In conclusion, I state that if mainstream hip-hop, which largely currently consists of male rappers, continues to produce and sell art to the devoted fans, and especially the female fans rappers often brag about, those involved have to start taking accountability and responsibility for the messages sent about black female subjectivity. Selling products called art, which insist on perpetuating and reiterating distorted, limited, narrow, and harmful representations of black women, while black femininity continues to assert itself against a racist and sexist society, undermines the efforts of black feminism and other forms of protest that seek to liberate marginalized and oppressed groups of people in various ways. The male-centric messages articulated in the male-dominated industry of hip-hop do reflect a patriarchal society, but they deny and continue to ignore the reality of the agentic forces such as that of black femininity, which resist and cannot be contained by ideals purported by hegemonic masculinity. While female rappers like Mosley seem to respond to male rappers' lyrics in reinventing black female subjectivity, male rappers seem to be largely unresponsive to these subjectivities and persist to preserve narrow and oppressive views about black women in their music.
Thank you.
Time for questions. Would you like to do a few questions and write them down? Hopefully, a question for each presenter. We have about 15 minutes before people get hangry. Lunch is coming. Go ahead, please. Please stand up and make a question.
Wamuwi, I wanted to ask you, have you considered looking at writings by Skollie and including it in people living how she thinks I wanted to ask about this idea of, I don't know, queen, females in the rap industry looking at themselves or being looked at as queen, and the queen or the first lady to an extent. So they always have to sort of be brought out in that way. It's like the first lady or this female and grouped in that sense, when they come out. I'm not sure how to take that.
Yes.
Okay. Mine is not a question.
I
thought you said I should talk.
No, but listen, but let's keep our statements
Sorry.
okay, I don't know.
Okay,
People can talk, but yes, whatever questions people have, let's ask the questions first.
Okay.
And then let's see if we can keep comments to the end, so that people have time to respond, yeah? Yes? No?
I was curious, Lizelle, if you could potentially offer up a critique of the naming of cinema from the continent as African. In the same way where Karen there's a discourse in contemporary visual arts about identifying all art from the continent as under the banner of African art, and the term itself being rather problematic and possibly homogenizes the diversity of practice that exists here. And also how female filmmakers from the continent fit within the historical narrative of cinema on the continent. A closer investigation or unpacking of that, I think, might provide more of a definitive understanding of how feminism played itself out in the long story of female African filmmakers.
Yes?
Okay, hi, Tshepiso, yes, I'm Constantine. I just wanted to get your view or critiques about the Black Panther film, which is, so the Black Panther film is kind of like the first mainstream Afro-futuristic Black film, and it's done by Americans, which was my main kind of something I want to ask. What do you think, or what are your critiques about the Black Panther film?
Just a question about Lady Skollie's own writing. I was curious about your own conceptual, your own terminology. So you said things like truth and freedom, and I thought it was curious that they would operate with that kind of, sort of, they operated kind of descriptively healthy as well. So I'm wondering how you read them conceptually to read her. And then also, like, such a question about African film, I wondered also what the purchase of such a large category does in terms of thinking about even the debates, how are scholars thinking through the specific, even as individual texts, or thinking of the kind of detail and the last presentation of each of such a short text of film. So what happens when it's just a description of a narrative? What are the contestations of the forms of meaning? So we say there are many subjectivities, but it doesn't. What is the purchase of the large category?
Other questions? Can we answer them first and then see if we can make comments later? Who wants to go first?
I'll go. I'm not sure if it'll answer your question, but female rappers, in an interview with Slick or Rouge, once said that she doesn't want to be seen as a female rapper. She doesn't want to be continually addressed as a female rapper, and a lot of female rappers agree with her. And that's because they don't want to associate themselves with the kinds of images that have been portrayed about women in hip-hop music. So, and in my presentation I spoke about the play and the played complex. So they try as much as possible to keep within those conventions as well. And so obviously they come out superior and dominant as queens, just as male rappers usually have themselves as kings. Yeah.
Is that more? Yeah, I mean the whole kind of notion of African cinema as one thing is obviously something that I think about a lot, and it's quite complex. And over the years, I've sort of adapted my thinking about it as well. I mean, part of it is also, of course, through my film festival, is the idea that we're presenting films from Africa, and the rationale behind that is that, so we know kind of statistically that less than 1% of cinema, worldwide consists of African cinema. So there's a place for creating a category that you can then present to audiences. Within that category, of course, I always say to my students that we always have to refer to African cinema in the plural, so African cinemas, and we know that, you know, there's post-apartheid South African cinema, Egypt, on the other part of the continent, making films pretty much from the beginnings of cinema, whereas most of the sub-Saharan African countries only started making indigenous films after independence. So it's an extremely complex story. It's, you know, Francophone Africa has support from France, so that's a particular type of cinema that's completely different from East Africa, from Nollywood and Josiewood and Riverwood and Bongowood and all the woods that we find over Africa. So it's an extremely complex picture, and there is the danger of, when you create a category, that you're ghettoizing African cinema. And indeed, some African filmmakers, we've experienced that with the film festival, that some filmmakers don't want their films in an African film festival, because they just want to be known as filmmakers. They don't want to be known as an African filmmaker. So some filmmakers refuse that label, like Haile Gerima, the expat Ethiopian director. We've never been able to screen his films because he doesn't want it in African film festivals. So I think ultimately we're thinking in my own work with the festival, actually what we're trying to achieve is to incorporate African cinema into filmmaking worldwide. So we're saying, if you like films from Latin America or Japan or whatever, you like world cinema, you like experiencing other cultures or whatever, you should also be able to see African films. And that African cinema sort of gets incorporated into our filmmaking experiences to the point that we don't have to name it any longer. A festival like Toronto has done extremely well in incorporating African cinema into mainstream cinema. So in a way, running an African film festival, you're kind of, the ultimate goal is that there wouldn't be the need to run that festival anymore. So you're kind of working towards the destruction of the thing that you're building, in a way. So yeah, I mean, that's just some thoughts on the whole idea of African cinema. I completely understand the complexity of it. In terms of, just to maybe link it to your question, I think in my research I found, I think there's some mileage in terms of finding affinities and affiliations across the continent. And in my viewing of dozens and dozens of films by African women, you see recurring themes. You see, I think we've talked about this in this conference as well, but I think the notion of African feminism as well. There is there's some mileage in a kind of sisterhood, which of course is a very complex picture with lots of plurality, multiplicity, that is very ingrained within the idea. But I think there are some advantages of looking at a body of work from across the continent. Certainly, in my study of films by African women, I found similarities from across the continent that's really interesting. And I think ultimately, probably the biggest kind of discovery, which sounds quite simple, is that African women mostly make films about themselves and about their experiences. And I think this talking about experiential knowledge and lived experience, I think that's very prominent.
The reason is because no one else is depicting them. So
Yes.
you kind of, what else are you going to do? Why would I want to represent someone else?
Yeah.
And so no one is doing that for me.
So the Black Panther thing, I'm looking forward to Black Panther next year. I'm very excited, we'll be there in our car. So the thing is, with Black Panther, my critiques, as much as I think that it's very important for Black people to be depicted on big screens like that, the critique comes from who wrote Black Panther? Stan Lee. Stan Lee he's a white man and he's an American. So it becomes tricky when a comic is written already by a white man for it to be now. So obviously the director, the production is going to be very largely American based, and it talks to a critique that a lot of people who are now coming into the Afrofuturist space, they don't want to be called Afrofuturists. They've got a problem with the term Afrofuturism because they say that it talks to their Black American influence. You'll find, so there's a lady, I don't have time to get into it, but there's a Kenyan digital artist, Jeb Chuma, that I want to touch on. Jeb Chuma is vehemently opposed to the term Afrofuturism. She says she's a pan-African, Pan-African future something, but she's changed the term because that talks to her. She doesn't want Afrofuturist because Afrofuturist is still very much Black American. So in the Afrofuturist space, I guess Black Panther and the Wakanda could fit in there. But then also Wakanda, if you're watching, so for instance, if you're watching Spider-Man, they talk about Brooklyn and Washington, places that exist. So with the fact that when you talk about Black people, it's Wakanda doesn't exist. There's just a place as Wakanda, you know. They aren't talking about an actual historical place that existed to talk about maybe Kemet. They aren't referring to terms that have existed. So we're still this not real thing as much as they are trying to, I can see where it's going, and I'm glad that we've started moving into that direction, but there's a lot of work to be done, and it starts from who actually even starts writing the comics. And that's why I'm excited by Loyiso Mkhize, who's written Kwezi, which is a South African comic. The name Kwezi keeps reoccurring in Afro, it's weird. So he's written a comic called Kwezi. It's based in South Africa, Johannesburg. Eugene, who's written Umzingeli. So I think when we start writing our stories, we can actually start then depicting our stories, and it won't be a thing of Wakanda. But where is Wakanda? Yeah. Have I answered your question?
Okay, bringing up the rear. Yes, in the larger project, I do talk about, and I just don't run out of time to talk about Laura Lindberg's or Lady Skollie's written work and some of the contrast between that, you know, and the very much more visible sort of visual stuff and why that is the case, you know, in which sectors people find the visual stuff more appealing or more worthy of their attention as opposed to some of the written stuff that she's written about gender violence and things like that. And to your question, I was sort of, you know, when you're sort of speaking something that you're kind of writing out, it's very difficult to kind of signpost inverted commas, but I do agree. When you're talking around terms like freedom and things like that, there is always a sense of like, what does that actually mean? What are we speaking of when we speak about that? So I will retroactively insert the inverted comma. Obviously, a term like freedom is always something that has to be sort of negotiated or spoken about in a very kind of provisional sense. And I think that in Lady Skollie's work, that sense of the provisional is what is being examined. You know, like what does it mean when we put those things, when we set those things up for examination? Whose freedom is being examined? Whose freedom is taken for granted versus, you know, who doesn't actually have it? So, which might answer your question.
I was going to ask you, how does the iconography of the eyes signal, how is it being read as a future? You know, if it's black. Is that just a thing?
We don't know what's in the future. Yeah. So the hollowness is that it's still to be written, it's still to be decided. Yeah. So that's what the hollowness.
I've always felt that as much as possibility as Afrofuturism offers, the thing that troubles me is that it means usually that we have to imagine these possibilities in the future means that they're not present for us today. You know, yes. That's always troubled me because it means that life isn't viable right now. So I have to imagine my freedom in the future. You know? Anyway, so somebody, you had a comment. Yes. Yeah, please do. And then we are going to lunch, and the lunch is in the same place as yesterday. It's in Barrett, which I have no idea how to get to. I just remember going and eating. So please, yeah.
Thank you very much. Scholars we are good at attending conferences, colloquium, writing papers, publishing, and it ends there. Everybody goes home. How many of us are acting? So after now, it is true that feminism is a theory that advocates for equality between male and female. So what is feminism to you? That is the question we should be asking ourselves. Then what are we doing after now? We're going to write the paper and then we go back to our offices and continue. So for me, this is me. I want to stand for what I am. Feminism is survival of the fittest, intellectual survival, marital survival, social survival, economic survival, and everything that would make you to do what? Survive. That is what for me feminism is. Now hear me, if you don't try to survive, And it's also about let the woman go. I repeat, for me, feminism is what? Let me go. Let the woman go. Because if you are not fem, if you don't try to survive, people are ready to pull you down. And you must have the backup. What is your backup if you want to stand up to talk about feminism? I'm talking about backup here, I'm talking about spirituality. Literature, philosophy, religion, there is spirituality. Before you say you want to rise up to say, I am a feminist, make sure you have a backup. I work in the university. We had a female professor in dramatic arts, and she was graduating PhD. So she was doing well. The male scholars got ready for her. You know, when I see people, professors, and they are young, 45, 30 professors, come to Nigeria, come to West Africa. You have gray hair before you can become professor here. To get promoted, you must be extra good. I mean, you can see the way I'm talking. You have to have something to beat the men for them to consider you to be promoted. So, and then she was graduating. People were not graduating. She was graduating PhDs, and they got ready. Now, what happened? Of course, Faculty of Arts, the men sit separately. We young lecturers, we sit at the back. You know your level. One day I got angry. I went to sit in front because I had to survive. I sat there. And then what happened? Somehow the brother-in-law came from wherever, and the husband insisted that she must accompany the brother-in-law back to the airport. And she didn't want to go. She had a program where she needed. And she was like, I don't want to escort him. Guess what? I told you feminism is survival. She escorted somebody who had not been home for 20 years and she died. We lost her in the faculty. I'm talking about true life story. The man died. The person who came from wherever died. Now the man who asked her to accompany the brother is alive. So when you're talking about feminism, I want to call attention to something. There's a physical, there's a spiritual. For those of us who have read So Long a Letter, you see Long Letter by Mamaputle, you see that at 50, that woman was coming up with something. She wrote just the first novel. She came up with the second one. Africans, look, I'm from West Africa. All those things you see in African magic is real, really real. So they got ready. Okay, Senegalese writer wants to come and tell us what to do. Bash, they cut her off. I'm trying to wake her. I don't know if I'm exceeding my boundaries, but look at what my sister said. I mean, the second speaker. She was really saying what is there. So when you want to stand up to say you want to fight after writing, know that you have to have something extra. For me, I pray, open the Bible, Psalm 35, plead my cause, oh God, fight together, fight against me. I don't go talking when I know that I have not got it, because I know where I'm coming from. I don't know what goes on in South Africa, but I'm from West Africa. It's a real, when I mean real fight, it's a real fight. So what is feminism? I just want to read survival. Just survive. If they don't want to let you go, map out strategy. Don't just sit and say, yes, I know what I'm doing. Not that. Thank you very much.
No, it's a real fight here too. So thank you. We need the energy. Thank you for all that. So now, sustenance for our body. We've had sustenance and awakening for our mind. So let's go on. Bathrooms, toilets, all of that.